For those who don't know me, I'm Cheryl Camillo. I'm an assistant professor here at Johnson Shoyama, as well as a director of the Master of Health Administration program. And I'm extremely pleased today to be here with Elizabeth May, leader of the Green Party of Canada, as well as the first elected member of parliament from the Green Party representing the Saanich Islands in South Vancouver Island. We have had the chance to speak for a few minutes prior to coming to this room, and I can tell you she is amazingly knowledgeable about public policy and public administration, and has many connections to Johnson Shoyama, whom our school is named after, which she might tell you about when we get to the discussion section. She's stopped here in Saskatchewan. We're very privileged and fortunate to have her on a whistle-stop tour of Canada, literally a whistle-stop tour because she's taking a train and bus across Canada, speaking on a number of issues, including climate change. She will speak for about 20 minutes today and then take questions and answer, or take questions from students both here in Regina and Saskatoon, and I'll moderate that. Before she starts, I'd like to tell you a little bit more about her achievements and accomplishments. And
I'm really old now, so the list of so-called achievements and accomplishments has gotten embarrassingly long.
One of the primary ones is she was named an Officer of the Order of Canada in 2005, and that's because of decades-long leadership in the environmental movement. And that started when she was a young woman growing up in Nova Scotia and got involved in efforts to prevent spraying of Agent Orange in the forest there. She then went to law school at Dalhousie and graduated and worked in public interest advocacy for several years in Ottawa, including on the Indigenous file. And then later moved into government as a special policy advisor to the Minister of Environment, where she had a role in establishing several of the national parks here in Canada. After which she became the head of the Sierra Club of Canada and served in that role for 17 years before becoming the head of the Green Party and being elected to Parliament. She's also a mother and grandmother, and of particular interest to us here at the school, a scholar. She has taught at Queen's University and Dalhousie and has written 8 books. And the most recent is Who Are We? Who We Are, Reflections on My Life and on Canada. So without further ado, thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Cheryl. Thanks to students in Saskatoon. Thanks to students here in Regina. I want to acknowledge we're on the traditional territory of Treaty 4, First Nations, and acknowledge with gratitude their generosity. Miigwech. So yes, Saskatchewan's, I would just digress enough to say Saskatchewan's played a big role in the trajectory of my life that Cheryl just shared with you, in that the position with, and the enormous good luck. My life could be described as a whole bunch of serendipity, but in any case, one piece of enormous good luck was when the Federal Minister of Environment in 1986 persuaded me to leave the practice of law to be a policy advisor, his senior policy advisor in Ottawa. So that's when I really learned how government works when it works well. And it did work well in that era when it was a majority progressive conservative government under Brian Mulroney. And after 2 years of being there, I actually resigned on a matter of principle because my boss broke the law in approving permits for dams in Saskatchewan. So the Rafferty-Alameda Dam issue is when I was quite suddenly jettisoned. I mean, I made my own decision. If this kind of thing can happen while I'm senior policy advisor and it's done behind my back, then clearly I don't really have a job anymore. But it was a trade-off to satisfy Grant Devine. They cut corners to give permits for Rafferty and Alameda dams. They said, okay, you'll be happy because you'll get Grasslands National Park. And in the bargain, Saskatchewan will translate its statutes into French, which will show the Quebec that Brian Mulroney can accomplish bilingualism. Never mind how bad that was, but that's when I left government. But during those 2 years that I worked in government was when I got to know one of my dearest friends and most significant mentors of my life, whose name was Jim McNeil. And it's through Jim McNeil that Al Johnson and Tommy Shoyama and I would spend time sitting at Jim's condo, Jim and Phyllis McNeil. They all worked in T.C. Douglas's government. They all went, that the Saskatchewan Mafia arrived in Ottawa and made a real difference. But it's through my friend Jim McNeil, who, by the way, was also from Saskatchewan, a graduate of the University of Saskatchewan, and who became, through many places in the federal civil service of the Government of Canada, including advising Pierre Trudeau on the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. There was a moment when they almost put the right to a healthy environment in the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, and the only way I know that is that Jim McNeil told me. But through Jim McNeil, when I came here to this institution, I thought, Johnson Shyama, could it be Tommy Shyama? And Al Johnson, I knew them, particularly Al, really well. We spent a lot of time visiting because they were two of Jim's best friends. And Jim passed away far too soon. In spring of 2017. So miss him every day. But that's my connection to the Institute and the very fine tradition, the intellectual tradition, the deeply principled moral and ethical tradition of Al Johnson and Tommy Shyama. And I am honored to stand in a place that bears their name. Now, I'd initially said that what I wanted to talk about today, because it's what I always want to talk about, is the climate crisis. And I've been giving lectures under the title 1.5 to Stay Alive. So I want to tell you about where that comes from and why it's true, and then open up the floor to any questions and conversation, either from students in Saskatoon or here in Regina. I've been working on the climate issue since 1986, when I went to work for the Ministry of Environment. I had come out of, as you heard from the introduction, a lot of work on pesticides as a volunteer. I'd done a lot of work on energy policy, particularly against nuclear power. My earliest friends in Saskatchewan were all in the Interchurch Uranium Committee. So that's my sort of environmental movement volunteer work before I went to the Office of the Minister of Environment. I'd worked on acid rain, but when I got to Environment Canada, the Environment Canada scientists were already working on the issue of global warming, climate change. And I learned the science from Environment Canada scientists before the myth of doubt was invented. And if Jim McNeil was here, he would tell you that at the Rio Earth Summit in 1992, where the Secretary General was another Canadian of prairie origins, Morris Strong, but 1992 in the Earth Summit, Jim always said, was when the Carbon Club was formed. It's when the large fossil fuel industries, big oil, realized that governments around the world were actually serious about climate change. We signed and ratified a convention in that year. Every single government on Earth stood on a stage and said, we're serious about the threat of global warming. And the range was from George Bush to Fidel Castro, everybody. It was the largest gathering of heads of government in the history of the planet at that time. But what Jim noted was that's when the Carbon Club formed, because big oil realized, oh, this could affect our profits. What do we do? And they began a campaign of deliberate misinformation that was global, but particularly targeted on North America. So we began to have people say, well, we don't really know if it's true. There's two sides to the story. And shamefully, media that should have known better carried it as if there was some debate about whether burning fossil fuels was going to endanger our future. And one of the early challenges of this issue, and it was the Framework Convention on Climate Change, which is the document to which I refer, still every country on Earth is legally bound to its terms, said that we have to reduce greenhouse gases sufficiently quickly so that we stabilize in a new level of atmospheric carbon dioxide concentrations that would avoid levels that could become dangerous. So the word in the convention is dangerous. It isn't reflected in the 1992 treaty in terms of parts per million CO2. And sometimes we campaigned around parts per million CO2. Sometimes we campaigned around percentage reductions. But we began to, what's dangerous? So the IPCC, which was formed in 1988, with great leadership from Canada, by the way, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, was formed so that governments could get policy advice based on science that is inherently complex and incredibly interdisciplinary. You've got roles in climate science for mathematicians, physicists, biologists, ecologists, marine biologists. It's hardly a discipline you can think of that isn't touched as you figure out climate science. And the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change involves the leading scientists in every country, but they're appointed by their governments. And every report of the IPCC has to go through the most phenomenally time-consuming, one might say time-wasting, governmental review process. It's the ultimate peer review process because they look at every document published in the science and they review it and they decide which levels of science have what level of confidence. So they'll report where there's 90% confidence versus some it might be 50% confidence. But at the 90 to 95 degree level of confidence is when they say, yeah, this is what's happening. We know it. That's why. So in the IPCC, they were initially asked what looks dangerous. They struggled with this. They said, well, certainly if we double carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere, that's very dangerous. And at no time in the last million years have CO2 concentrations exceeded 280 parts per million. We used to only talk about parts per million, not 1.5. Well, we're now at over 400 parts per million. We're the first human beings in the history of our species to breathe air with 400 parts per million CO2. But then they said, okay, well then they started changing the focus. Well, what is the impact at 400 parts per million? If we hold it to below 425 parts per million, can humanity survive? Will the biosphere still be hospitable for us and other species that we'd like to keep around? Then they shifted from talking about parts per million, and a particular workshop in the UK said, if we know one thing, we have to ensure we stay below 425 parts per million because that will inevitably take us to 2 degrees Celsius. And 2 degrees Celsius is maybe safe. Like, we won't go extinct. That's what we mean by safe now. We don't mean we won't have extreme weather events. There is no safe that means no extreme weather events. There is no safe that doesn't mean droughts. There is no safe available to us now that doesn't mean hundreds of thousands of environmental refugees. What we're doing is trying to hold on to a world in which we can survive as a species with other species. So 2 degrees became a thing. And when we went to Copenhagen in 2009, which was COP15, which was supposed to be the global negotiation. By the way, when I say COP, back to public policy and buzzwords of the UN, the 1992 Framework Convention on Climate Change being a treaty with force of law, once a country ratifies a treaty, they become a party to the treaty. This may be, I'm sorry for covering stuff you probably all know, but when you're a party to the treaty doesn't just sit on a shelf. Any treaty, biodiversity treaty, Montreal Protocol on ozone, which by the way was Canadian leadership to save the ozone layer in 1987. But the treaty is a living document. It's kind of a parliament. And every year under every treaty, the parties to the convention gather. Parties being nation states. So the conference of the parties is the COP, right? So Kyoto hosted COP3. Kyoto, Japan was where COP3 happened, and that's where they negotiated the Kyoto Protocol. COP15 in Copenhagen was supposed to be where we negotiated the next phase. It was a disaster. But one of the things that happened in Copenhagen was that the industrialized countries kind of met in a back room and said 2 degrees is fine. 2 degrees looks safe. So we're going to design a non-binding, can you believe they came up with the language politically binding, a politically binding treaty which will aim towards 2 degrees Celsius as a safe landing zone for humanity. And the science was already pretty clear that 2 degrees was very dangerous. And at 2 degrees global average temperature increase, and I'll just back up and give you a little factoid for science, for a frame of reference for this. Global average temperature is a very different thing than the weather forecast, right? So in Saskatchewan, I'm sure you get some 30-plus summer days and some minus 30 winter days. So 1.5 degrees may sound trivial. But the difference in global average temperature is a different thing. So the difference in global average temperature between right now on planet Earth and 10,000 years ago when Canada was under several kilometers of ice, the difference was 5 degrees Celsius. So 1 degree is huge. We're already at 1 degree Celsius global average temperature increase over what it was before the Industrial Revolution. So the debate in Copenhagen was, is 2 degrees safe? Well, the science was clear that at 2 degrees Celsius, all the low-lying island states would be underwater. So the delegates from Fiji, Mauritius, Maldives, kind of angry that the industrialized world thought 2 degrees was okay. Yeah, we can move inland. They're underwater. Yeah. It also was very clear that 2 degrees Celsius, we'd lose too much of the Arctic, too much Arctic ice to be sure that we'd actually sustain ice on the North Pole year-round, which is also essential. The ice mass on the North Pole is one of the reasons that global average temperature and that climate systems have been stable. You want to know why it got so cold in so many parts of the world this winter? Because the polar vortex is collapsing because of warmer air moving into the Arctic, pushing polar air down. But what it also is because it's driven by warmer water in the Arctic and melting ice. So going back to Copenhagen and the disastrous negotiations there, and suddenly as governments, Barack Obama, Stephen Harper, and by the way, the Prime Minister of Denmark at the time, Prime Minister Rasmussen, I hold primarily responsible for this train wreck, but he had a lot of colluding help. Suddenly, all the delegates from every low-lying island state and every delegate from the continent of Africa stood up and walked out. And as they walked out of I've never seen anything so dramatic. UN negotiations are generally, if anyone's ever participated, it's a lot like watching paint dry. You don't expect anything exciting to happen. And suddenly every delegate from Africa, every delegate from a low-lying island state stood up, walked out, chanting, 1.5 to stay alive. Everyone, in unison, walking out of the convention. And they were joined by all the youth, every young person from Canada, every young person from the United States. And that's when I saw this old north-south divide that had caused us so much problem in international negotiations. It's why the first UN conference on the environment, which was in 1972 in Stockholm, Morris Strong had also been the Secretary General for that one, by the way. But in 1972 in Stockholm, most of the developing world boycotted because they said pollution is an issue for you in northern countries. It doesn't affect us. We've got to get food. We've got to have a stable future. We are not wealthy enough yet to worry about pollution, so that's your issue, not ours. Indira Gandhi was the only developing country leader to attend Stockholm in 72. So it was a really big deal that the Earth Summit in 1992 was hosted by Brazil that had boycotted 1972. So there's a story here, there's a narrative of what nations do when they get together, what can be done when they're determined. And to have a train wreck, like this train wreck that we saw in Copenhagen, also signaled something new. Developing countries are in the lead, not reluctantly looking for a north-south bargain like in Rio, not reluctantly saying, okay, we'll do something about pollution, but first we need to see some larger transfers for development assistance. We've allowed the climate crisis to get so much worse when we signed the 1992 convention that by 2009 in Copenhagen, it's the developing countries who are saying, our very existence depends on going off fossil fuels. And you want to buy us off? Because that's what Hillary Clinton as Secretary of State in Copenhagen, and then followed by Barack Obama as president, put on the table. Basically, we're not going to reduce pollution so much in the United States, but by 2020, there'll be a global climate fund with $100 billion a year for developing countries. Yeah. And as the delegate for Tuvalu said that day, we don't want your 20 pieces of silver. Our children's future is not for sale. So now we have a very different alignment. We have the poorest of the poor nations working with the world's youth because nobody else seems to be paying attention that we're in a climate emergency. And we are in a climate emergency. We are in a situation where the strongest voice on the planet right now for climate action is not any elected official from any country around the world. The strongest voice for climate action is a 16-year-old girl named Greta Thunberg from Stockholm, who is leading the student strike movement. There will be a student strike event here in Regina because it's a global event this Friday, March 15th. And wait a second. Make sure I give you the details. I'm sure that there's also one in Saskatoon, by the way. But it's March 15th from 10 to 11 at the Saskatchewan Legislative Building, Regina's school climate strike. There are hundreds of thousands of children marching to say one thing really clearly. We don't want to hear you talk about transition. We don't want to hear you talk about everything will be great because the environment and the economy go hand in hand, and we're making incremental changes that are so much better than if you elected the other people. What they want to hear is that someone understands that what the IPCC is now telling us, which is in the report of October 8th, 2018, because even when we negotiated in Paris in 2015 and put together the Paris Agreement, which through a number of really good political miracles and good chairing by the French government, particularly the president of that COP, COP21, Laurent Fabius, former president of France. You know what? If you looked up Laurent Fabius before COP21, he would have been more known for being the person who was the fall guy for the government of France blowing up the Greenpeace vessel in Auckland. Thank goodness he lived long enough and was skillful enough and a dedicated, decent chair of a convention who drove the world to a 1.5 degree goal for the Paris Accord. But it's still largely unenforceable. It depends on governments stepping up and doing their part. And the IPCC report of 2018, which was requested by the Paris negotiations. What's the difference between 1.5 and 2 degrees Celsius? Well, it is now settled science that 2 degrees Celsius is beyond dangerous. 2 degrees Celsius puts us on a path for irreversible, unstoppable, self-accelerating global warming from the impact of positive feedback loops. 1.5 is survivable. And the really great news is we still have the opportunity as a species, as a collection of governments, multilaterally, our species has the ability to hold to 1.5 degrees. It is doable, but it's not easy. It will require quite Herculean efforts. It will require massive efforts to go off fossil fuels as rapidly as possible, and certainly zero fossil fuel use by 2050, and roughly half as much as now by 2030. Now that's a goal. All right. But when John F. Kennedy said he was going to put a man on the moon, he had no idea how they were going to do it. On this issue, we actually have tons of ideas for how we have to do it. The IPCC said, we don't need any new inventions. We're not lacking for technology. We don't lack the science. We absolutely know what we need to do to hold to 1.5 degrees Celsius global average temperature increase, to keep every low-lying island state above the waterline, to ensure that there's Arctic ice year-round. Well, even at 1.5 degrees Celsius, we're going to have one day a year with no Arctic ice. But to keep it there mostly, to revert and to stop the rapid acidification of our oceans, to keep ocean life alive. All of these things we can do, but the IPCC did say the one thing we are missing is political leadership and political will, which also could just be described as honesty and courage. So honesty and courage are in very short supply. And in Canada, the least honest, the most ignorant, leading the charge to the next election is Andrew Scheer, because he doesn't understand climate science at all. But the Liberals in government have left in place Stephen Harper's goal, which is wholly inadequate to meet even it's certainly inadequate and incompatible with hitting 2 degrees. And the plans that are in place to hit Harper's target, at this point, don't reach the Harper target. So Canada, for all our talk of global leadership, is at the back of the pack. I know, in terms of intention and understanding of the science, that Justin Trudeau as a person, as an individual, understands climate science, and Andrew Scheer does not. But the net effect of both parties' sets of policies is the same: runaway global warming and abandoning our children. So that's why 1.5 to stay alive has resonated with me. It hit me when the report came out October 8th, 2018, from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. How prescient were those delegates from Africa and the low-lying island states. 1.5 to stay alive is not just a slogan and not just a chant as you walk out of a room. It's a scientific reality, and we all have to deal with it in ways that reflect honesty and courage, because we know we can avoid going above it. We know we can do it in ways that create a prosperous Canada and everybody has a job and it's much more positive and the quality of life goes up. But we still debate carbon taxes as if that's the issue. And it's not even coming close to addressing the problem.
Unfortunately, our time has come to a close because we have classes starting. But I want to close by saying that in listening to the dialogue and Ms. May's presentation, I came to understand why not only has she achieved the awards that I enumerated in introducing her, but why she was also named by her colleagues in Parliament as the hardest working, most collegial, and smartest colleague that they had.
Thank you. It's really nice when your colleagues give you an award like that. I'm working on Miss Congeniality. That'll be my ultimate accolade.
So please join me in thanking her for the time that she spent with us today.
Thank you. It's a privilege and an honor to stand in a place. I want to end where I started. A privilege and an honor to stand in the place of my friends Al Johnson and Tommy Shoyama. And God bless you, Jim. I sure miss you. Thank you.